I would like to begin by paying my respects to the traditional owners on whose lands we all meet today and to their elders past and present. I myself am here at Monash University's Clayton campus on the lands of the Bunurong people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. It's only by listening to and learning from the traditional custodians and knowledge holders of these unceded lands that we can really determine a better future for Australia and to improve the well-being of the people and planet we live on. Next slide, please, Cameron. My name's Nicola. I'm the Director of Strategy and Engagement at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. Founded in 2007 by Monash University, our institute is an independently funded research, education and policy think tank whose purpose is to improve the well-being of people and planet for current and future generations. We work across 6 key areas: climate action, environment and health, sustainable cities and regions, circular economy, inclusive prosperity and leadership for the SDGs. And what we do is convene and collaborate with governments, industry, academia and communities to shape policy, build capacity and develop strategies to support sustainable development. We provided input to the United Nations to shape the Sustainable Development Goals back in 2013 and have significant expertise in mobilising SDG implementation. This is our third Transforming Australia report, using the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a holistic framework to measure the state of our nation and to explore pathways forward. And what perfect timing with the budget just announced last night as well. Through this research, we're looking to paint a picture of what good could look like and to stimulate conversation about the shifts we need to secure a better future for Australia. We've got 2 key speakers today: Professor John Thwaites, who's the chair of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, who'll provide background and an overview of the research, and lead researcher Dr. Cameron Allen, who's chief analyst and modeller, who will go into the findings in detail. Following their presentations, we have time for some questions, so please type your questions into the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll respond at the end. I'd now like to introduce John. John is a professorial fellow at Monash University and chair of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. Among his many other roles, John is also co-chair of the Leadership Council of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which works for the UN Secretary General to mobilise the world's universities, think tanks and national laboratories for action on the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. He also chairs that network for the Australia-Pacific region. Previously, John's held many other roles and was Deputy Premier for quite a period of time in Victoria, where he was responsible for a lot of health, social and environmental reform, including Victoria's first climate change minister. And accordingly, he was appointed a member of the Order of Australia in 2021. So over to you, John, for this third Transforming Australia report. Next slide.
Well, thank you very much, Nicola, and I'm very pleased to join this webinar today and to welcome everyone to the report on Transforming Australia. As Nicola said, we at Monash Sustainable Development Institute took part in the development of the Sustainable Development Goals back in 2013 to 2015. And since then, we have been reporting on our achievement of the goals in Australia. The first report was in 2018, and that was an assessment that was led by the National Sustainable Development Council, which was a council of experts who set indicators and targets for Australia under the Sustainable Development Goals. Then in 2020, we followed up with a report focusing very much on the impact of COVID on progress, using a more limited set of indicators. And then in 2024, we did the work for this assessment, the third assessment, which we're reporting on today. And In short, this provides a helicopter view of the state of Australia, how we're progressing on the things that matter. Next slide, please. Now, on the screen, you'll see the report, and underneath the URL link, and I urge all of you on the call to go on that link and have a look at the report. But we believe that by tracking progress against the Sustainable Development Goals, we can help Australia drive economic prosperity, protect our planet, build a more inclusive Australia, and also build trust and safety and partnerships across the country. And we also hope that this report can help decision makers, government, policy makers focus more on the longer term issues facing Australia, which are going to be absolutely critical for the next generation. We also hope that it'll help inform a conversation amongst Australians about the future of Australia. Next slide, please. Now, why do we report against the Sustainable Development Goals? Why have we chosen to use them as the basis for reporting on the state of Australia? Essentially, it's because the Sustainable Development Goals are the agreed global framework on sustainable development. All countries, including Australia, agreed that they would be the framework for sustainable development from 2015 to 2030. And that also enables us to make global comparisons between how Australia is performing and other comparable countries on these key goals. The second important reason we choose the goals is that they are an integrated framework. The whole point of the goals is to see how the achievement of different goals impacts on other goals. And that helps us in developing more integrated policy making as opposed to siloed policy making. So we believe that by using the goals, we can compare ourselves to other countries, but also we can develop more integrated thinking. Next slide, please. Well, to talk a little bit about the way the Transforming Australia report works, first, we look back at progress from the year 2000 to date, and we assess against 80 different indicators how we're performing in Australia. In terms of those indicators, there's a good balance of indicators, some 26 economic indicators, 27 social indicators, and 27 environmental indicators. And in looking back, we look at the historical trends, but we also look at more recent trends and highlight the progress against the targets that we've set for 2030. But in this report, we do something new, which is also to look forward to 2050. And Dr. Cameron Allen has led this modelling work, which he will talk more about after I've finished. And that explores future pathways for Australia to achieve the goals by 2030 and by 2050. And essentially that uses systems dynamic modelling, which demonstrates that we can achieve the goals if we implement a suite of policies, of ambitious policies. Now, it's really important that we put this report, the Transforming Australia report, in the context of the federal government's wellbeing strategy. And the federal government has what it calls the measuring what, the measuring what matters indicators. And I'd just like to talk a little bit about how what we're doing complements that. There's about half of the indicators that we deal with in our Transforming Australia where there's an overlap or similar to measuring what matters. But the other half of the indicators we look at aren't including in measuring what matters. And it's worth highlighting that they cover important sustainable development goals like poverty, and also we have a bigger focus on the environmental goals, so that if you look at our framework, it's very evenly balanced between the economy, the environment, and society. The other big difference in what we do compared to the federal government's measuring what matters is that we've set targets. And I know from my own experience, having been a government minister, just how important targets are if we're going to get government action. Because, frankly, without targets, very often you don't get departments moving, you don't get the policies that are needed. And that's why we've set these targets for 2030. Okay, we'll turn into the next slide, and this next slide after that, the headline results. Cameron Allen's going to talk in more detail about this, but overall, what it shows is a mixed scorecard. On about 34% of indicators, we are going backwards. On around 30%, we're on target, and just over a third, we're not on target. We're making some gains, but we're not making gains that are sufficient to achieve the targets by 2030. If you look at where we're on track, we seem to be doing better in goals 5, 6, 7, and 8. That is gender equity, water, energy, and the economy. But we're falling behind in goals 1, 2, 10, and 11, particularly around poverty and inequality, but also around sustainable cities. In the report, we've also highlighted some interesting recent changes since our 2020 report. For example, there has been an improvement in the gender gap in superannuation, or indeed in gender representation in Parliament, and a fairly rapid improvement in renewable energy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But since the 2020 report, we're seeing some areas not improve, and one of the concerning areas is Indigenous life expectancy, but also a falling back in socioeconomic parity in education. Next slide, please. And if you delve into the report, you'll see where we're going well. Overall, we're doing well on life expectancy. I mean, we continue to do well in tertiary education. It's a surprising figure to many that if we go back to 2000, only around 27% of working age Australians had a tertiary education, whereas now it's up around 49%. So there's a lot of things we're doing well, but the next slide shows a number of areas where we've really fallen backwards. And one of the ones that really is concerning is the adequacy of welfare benefits, which have considerably reduced since the year 2000, leading to financial stress amongst our most disadvantaged community. But we're also seeing other areas go backwards. And one of the real hand grenades in Australia is obesity. And if you look at obesity rates in the year 2000, it was about 25% of the population. That's grown to over 32% now. And so by looking where we're off track, we can prioritise our responses at a policy level, and we hope that this is used by decision makers to do that. Next slide, please. The good news, and Cameron's going to be talking about this, is that we can actually achieve more of the goals. And the scenario modelling that Cameron has done has shown that we can actually increase the achievement of the goals from around 55% in 2050 to 90% by using a suite of policies which Cameron will talk about. So if we go to the last slide, please, which really summarises the key takeaways. Australia has mixed progress on sustainable development. We're doing well in some areas, but we're trending backwards in others. we can turn these negative trends around, and our modelling confirms the key role for more ambitious and integrated policy, focusing on 6 big transformations. If we're going to do that, though, we need a more integrated and long-term approach to decision-making. And that approach is enabled first by regular assessments of progress, like we're doing with Transforming Australia. And those assessments need to cover the economy, society, and the environment. We also believe that progress will be enabled if we do adopt 2030 targets and evaluate trends against those targets. And we also believe that by using scenario modelling of policies and investments, we can identify whether we're likely to achieve those long-term targets and what the trade-offs and co-benefits are going to be through different policy measures. So that's a quick tour of the Transforming Australia. And now I'd like to hand over to Cameron Allen, Dr. Cameron Allen, who's going to talk in more detail about that. And Cameron is a Senior Research Fellow at Monash Sustainable Development Institute. He's been the Chief Analyst and Modeller for this project. And I should say that Cameron has recently received a DECRA, Discovery Career Researcher Award, which is a very prestigious award from the Australian Research Council to further his modelling work. Cameron.
Well, thanks very much, John, and good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining our webinar today. And I'd just like to start by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, who are the custodians of the lands where I'm based here in Brisbane, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. So I'm going to dig a bit more into the results. John's given you a great sort of headline overview of some of the findings, and now we'll dig a bit more into the data. And as John mentioned, there's 2 main components to our assessment, to our progress report: the assessment of Australia's progress to date on the SDGs, and then our forward-looking assessment, which includes our modelling. And I'll discuss both of those, but I'll start with the results for our progress assessment. And just quickly on the methods, so John mentioned we have 80 different indicators in the current assessment. The selection of indicators was actually led back in 2018 by the National Sustainable Development Council through a process that involved consultations with experts, criteria, etc. And we use a subset of that original indicator set for this current assessment. And as John mentioned, for each indicator, we also set a target value, which is a crucial part of our assessment. Setting targets is challenging, and we went through a decision process in order to set those, starting with the official targets that are included in the Sustainable Development Goals framework. So some of the indicators actually have specific target values, say halving poverty by 2030. But many of the targets actually don't include specific values. They say, a substantial improvement or a significant reduction, and leave it for countries really to interpret their level of ambition. So we then looked at national targets set by the government. The government does have a range of targets, say for renewables, for example. We then looked at targets that were set by the National Sustainable Development Council in our first assessment, or global benchmarks. So there's a range of different regional and global assessments on the SDGs, including the one that's led by the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and their global SDG index. So they include a range of really useful benchmarks for high-income countries like Australia. We also looked at OECD data, so looked at our peer countries and how they perform on specific indicators, and took an average of the top performing countries or an average of the OECD. And finally, failing that, we used the generic 1% improvement on the baseline by 2030. In terms of the methods for evaluating progress, so you can imagine that for each of our indicators, we have a time series hopefully from 2000 through until around 2023. And we also have a target value for 2030. So this enables us to firstly look at, what would be the desired target path that we'd need to be on in order to reach that target by 2030. And then we compare that with the actual time series data set. And we do that by looking at the rate of change in the time series and the rate of change that would be needed in order to reach that target. And we make a comparison, and if the time series data for an indicator shows 90% of the rate of change that would be needed to reach a target, we give it a green traffic light or on track. If it's between 50 and 90% of the rate that would be needed to reach a target, we give it a yellow traffic light or needs improvement. If it's between 0 and 50% of the rate of change needed to reach a target, we give it a breakthrough needed or orange. And finally, if it's actually going backwards, moving away from a target, then we assign a red traffic light or going backwards. So this is just a couple of examples of the types of charts we have on our website. So every indicator will have this chart on the left, which we call the target path chart, which has that comparison of the time series data with the target path. And it just gives you a really simple visual comparison of how we're tracking. In this case, the time series is on track to reach that target, albeit with some more improvement needed by 2030. And this indicator is for parliamentary seats held by women. We also include charts where we compare Australia with OECD peers. So we include 14 OECD peer countries in these charts. Many of the indicators have them on the website. And essentially, we rank the countries from worst to best. And we include an OECD average in purple and Australia data point in blue. So you can sort of see where Australia sits in amongst our peers on particular indicators. So if you look at our progress report, which you can download, it's a PDF file online. We structured the results from the assessment around 4 key domains. So we have the economy, society, environment, and governance, trust, safety, etc. So firstly, looking at some of the data on the economy, so we really see across our indicators that we have a pretty mixed economic outlook. We have seen some good progress in income, employment, and energy, but we're falling behind in areas such as innovation. So firstly, looking at per capita real net national disposable income. So this is average income for Australians. We've seen that steadily increase over time. It's certainly trending in the right direction, despite some reductions in particular years around the global financial crisis, around COVID, and more recently that impact from inflation. But overall, incomes are certainly going up at quite a steady rate on average. There's also good news in terms of employment. So we include a range of employment indicators in our assessment. So firstly, unemployment top left and underemployment at the top right, which have seen a good reduction in the last couple of years since COVID and are now on track to reach targets, as well as the youth unemployment rate at the bottom left and long-term unemployment rate at the bottom right. So these have also come down considerably since COVID. But some further improvement would be needed in order to reach those target levels. One area where we are falling behind is around investment and innovation. So when we look at the indicator for research and development expenditure as a share of GDP, that's really been going down since around 2007, 2008. And Australia really down the bottom of the pack in terms of OECD countries on research and development expenditure, well below the OECD average. Similarly, another indicator on innovation investment, in this case, knowledge-based capital or intellectual property. So we've seen that really also fall back over the last decade or so, and Australia down the bottom of the pack of our OECD peers, and again, well below the OECD average. In terms of renewable energies, we've really seen an acceleration in renewables in the last few years. And back in 2018, our National Sustainable Development Council, when we did our first assessment, set this 55% renewable energy target by 2030, which actually seemed pretty ambitious at the time. Australia is now on track to reach that target. Since then, the government has also set its own target, a high ambition target of 82%. And we can see that, some improvement would still be needed in order to reach that target by 2030. But overall, in terms of our peers, we're still, behind the OECD average in terms of the share of renewables, but, we are catching up. So when we look at greenhouse gas emissions, so a result of that more rapid transition to renewables, we see that greenhouse gas emissions have been steadily declining, albeit not quite fast enough to reach our target level by 2030. Again, when we look at the global data, this is per capita CO2 emissions. So we actually still have a lot of work to do. We have one of the highest per capita emissions among our OECD countries. Moving to our social indicators, so we can see that in terms of social equity and well-being, that we're really moving forward unevenly in Australia. There are, growing divides in a range of areas, including in income, in wealth, in education, and health outcomes. So firstly, Australia enjoys a really high level of life expectancy and tertiary education. So this is, good news. And certainly we're on track to reach those target levels. But there are, of course, disparities within the population where Indigenous life expectancy is around 9 years lower than non-Indigenous Australians. When we look at gender equality, so some of the indicators for gender equity on, the gender pay gap, on superannuation, on housework have all been improving. Still need some improvement in order to reach target levels, but we can certainly see that gender parity in superannuation, for example, on the left, and parity in housework have been heading in the right direction in recent years. Australia does have a persistent poverty problem. So poverty rates have not really changed much over the last couple of decades and remain persistently high at around 13%. So that's over 3 million Australians living in poverty, including around 760,000 children. So it's still a pretty shocking statistic for a high-income country like Australia. When we look at our global peers, we are worse than the OECD average and significantly worse than some of the leading countries, such as Finland, Denmark, France, etc. And one of the reasons for that is really the adequacy of welfare payments in Australia. And there's been some commentary about this, with the budget launched last night, that our job seeker payment is not really kept up with the cost of living. Back in 2001, we see that welfare payments were actually more or less sufficient to live at the poverty line. So this chart on the left shows the adequacy of welfare payments in relation to the poverty line. We've seen that that's steadily declined to around 65% of what would be needed to live at the poverty line. So it's probably no wonder we have a persistent poverty problem in Australia. We did see an improvement in that during COVID. So it shows there, what impact government policy can play in improving that indicator. And again, looking at the global data, we're really down the bottom of the pack on this indicator. And there are segments of the Australian society that are doing it particularly tough. When we look at data for low-income renter households, we see that around 42% of households are living in housing stress. So they're paying a significant proportion of their weekly salary on housing costs. And that has actually, it's not only a problem in cities, it's increasing also in regional areas. In terms of wealth inequality, we have seen a decline in wealth inequality in Australia. So this is the share of wealth that's held by the bottom 40% of households in Australia. And we've seen that decline from around 7.8% back in 2004 to around 5.5% in a couple of decades. And when we look at the different income groupings, we actually see, that the only share of households that have increased their wealth is the top 20%. Both the middle 40% and the bottom 40% have actually reduced in terms of their share of wealth over time. And a particularly concerning indicator is the one on socioeconomic parity in maths. And John mentioned this earlier. So this is essentially a measure of parity between education outcomes of high-income households or high socioeconomic households versus low socioeconomic households. And it shows that education outcomes for these lower-income households have been declining over time in terms of compared with higher income groups. This rapid decline is something that seems to be occurring in other OECD countries, but Australia is also down the bottom of the pack on this particular indicator. And it's concerning because this type of trend actually entrenches long-term disadvantage. And finally, when we look at psychological distress and suicide rates, we also see that those are increasing over time. They have increased in recent years. In the chart on the left here, we have persons with high and very high psychological distress. The chart on the right shows a comparison of the Indigenous and non-Indigenous population. So we see that, you know, these rates are actually more than double for our First Nations population. And they're also particularly acute for women, for young women. So when we look at the chart at the bottom there, the data for women is on the far right, and that green bar that's particularly high is for young women between 18 and 24. So rates of psychological distress are particularly high in that age group. So moving to our environmental indicators. So we have actually seen an expansion of the protected area network in Australia. The share of both marine key biodiversity areas and terrestrial key biodiversity areas that are protected have increased. Unfortunately, that hasn't really translated into outcomes for threatened species. So we've seen that the threatened species or red list index has actually continued to decline over time. And when we look at water efficiency, so again, Australia has performs pretty well on water efficiency. This is per capita water consumption, which has declined over time, and we're better than the OECD average on water efficiency. Our cities have some of the best air quality in the world, so concentration of particulate matter is particularly low, despite some spikes during bushfire years. And material consumption is also coming down. So this is material footprint per capita, which has been declining over time, albeit not fast enough to reach our target level. And we're sort of around the middle of the pack in terms of total resource consumption in our country. And finally, when we look at the circularity rate, so this is a measure of the amount of resources that are reused and recycled in our economy. This remains really low by global standards. It has actually gone backwards in recent years. We're below the global average, and we're well below the European average and leading countries like the Netherlands. And finally, when we look at our indicators on trust and safety, etc., we see that we live in a safe nation with comparatively high levels of trust, which is good news. So victims of homicide rates have continued to decline over time, and we're low by global standards. Most of the population feels safe walking at night. So over 90% of the population now feels safe walking at night, but the rate is higher for men than for women. And trust in institutions has also increased steadily over time, and is above peer countries like the USA, like the UK, Japan, Germany, France, and Sweden. So again, this is good news for Australia. And when we look at government revenue as a share of GDP, so despite some of the rhetoric we might hear around tax in Australia, when we look at the data for Australia and compare that against our OECD peers, we actually see that Australia is overall a pretty low taxing country, and well behind the OECD average. And this suggests that there is actually some room to move there in terms of increasing government revenue and using that to start to invest to try to turn around some of the negative trends that we've seen from this assessment. And finally, when we look at this is net overseas development assistance. So Australia at 0.19% of gross national income is well behind our OECD peers, well behind the OECD average, and also falls well short of that 0.7%, which Australia agreed to reach through, with other OECD countries through the UN. So we're not offering as much assistance to our developing partners as we could. Okay, so that's kind comes to the end of the first part, which is really looking back at our progress to date on the SDGs. And, as John mentioned, we really see mixed performance. Australia, it's a great country to live in. We have a high standard of living. And on a range of indicators, we're performing really well. But there are areas where we are lagging behind our peers. And a particular concern, I think, are those areas where we're actually moving backwards away from targets. So what can we do about it? So as John mentioned, this assessment, we've actually done some modelling to look ahead at the types of policies and types of levers that we have that could actually boost progress on the SDGs and start to turn these negative trends around. So our approach to the modelling was really to look at two potential post-COVID recovery pathways for Australia. So we model the COVID shock to Australia, and then we explore two alternative futures. Firstly, business as usual pathway, where Australia pretty much returns to the types of policy settings and expenditure levels we had leading into the crisis. And secondly, a Transform Australia pathway, which is an ambitious policy scenario where Australia adopts a range of SDGs policies to boost progress on the SDGs by 2030. So we project those two alternative futures through until 2030, and our model is able to evaluate the amount of progress that each pathway makes on 80 different SDGs indicators and targets that we have embedded in our model. We then also extend those projections through until 2050 to look at the longer term picture. So what happens over the longer term once these policies are implemented? And I should mention here that the Transform Australia pathway really has those policies implemented over a 10-year period. So it's from 2021 through to 2030 as a sort of a stimulus to really boost progress on the SDGs by 2030. After that period, they're sort of wound back and we include a range of policies to achieve net zero. So again, just looking at the two pathways, as I mentioned, business as usual is very much a continuation of pre-COVID settings where, we assume incremental progress without any additional efforts to achieve the SDGs. Our Transforming Australia pathway, in contrast, adopts a range of bold policy measures. And we structure them around 6 key transformations or 6 key policy domains, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. But it's important to note also that that the government has actually implemented some of these policies since we did the modelling. So Australia's not necessarily sitting on this business as usual pathway. We're somewhere in the mix. And this includes policies like, ditching the stage 3 tax cuts, accelerating renewables and the net zero transition, investments in green industry and manufacturing, etc. And in the model, that obviously requires, these policies require some additional government investment. We estimate that would be about additional 7% of expenditure over 10 years to 2030. And that expenditure is actually financed in our model through additional revenue. So governments could, in theory, borrow additional money to fund that or finance that investment. In our modelling, we actually adjust our tax settings to make sure that the additional investment's budget neutral. What are the 6 transformations? So as I mentioned, our Transform Australia pathway is really structured around six key domains. Why do we use these? Well, they are identified by global experts as having the greatest potential of accelerating progress on the SDGs. So they include well-being and resilience, a sustainable and just economy, sustainable food systems, energy decarbonisation, sustainable urban development, and regenerating the environment. And for the purposes of our modelling, we then identify a range of policy levers or policy shifts that would enable these different transformations. So each of the 6 transformations has a range of policies that we identify. I won't go through all of these. I'll come back to some of the policies later and their effects in the model. But essentially, they include things like additional investment in health, education, climate change adaptation, more progressive tax reforms and social transfers, as well as a range of incentives to increase investment in green manufacturing, in infrastructure, in the net zero transition, in renewables, supporting sustainable agriculture, as well as regenerating the environmental commons, so including reforestation, etc. Now, each of these 16 policies that we identify is then quantified in our model. So each policy has a quantitative setting associated with it, whether it's a level of investment or an amount of efficiency gains or whatever it may be. And we calibrate our model using or parameterize our model using those settings and make a projection through till 2030 or 2050. And we do that, at the aggregate level. So we look at all 16 policies together. When we implement them all at the same time, what are the aggregate effects then for the SDGs in 2030 and 2050? We also do it transformation by transformation. So we look at the individual effects of the policies on SDGs achievement. So it enables us to unpack these projections a bit more and see, which policies are delivering the biggest gains on the SDGs. Just quickly on our model. So we use a model called the ISDG Australia model. It was the base model was originally developed by the Millennium Institute, which is a global think tank that specializes in developing models for national policy analysis and development planning. And the model's been sort of adapted and calibrated for Australia using over 30 years of historic data for calibration and validation. The model itself is built in the system dynamics language, and it's a simulation model. So it's designed to run sort of what-if type scenarios. If we change this policy, what would be the outcome over the long term for a range of indicators that we're interested in? If we change this assumption, what would be the outcomes for different indicators? The model itself is very large. It has over 3,000 variables, and it's structured around the key domains of sustainable development. So in the outer ring there, we see the green ring, which includes the environmental modules. So this includes things like land, soil, water, energy, emissions, etc. In the red ring there are our social modules, which includes population and demographic modules, things like education, health, income distribution, poverty, etc. And in the center, our economic modules, which include production in key sectors, agriculture, industry, services, aggregate GDP, government expenditure, household income, etc. And I should mention also that the model has been peer-reviewed in a number of studies that we've published in different journals, and the results from this study were actually published recently in Nature. And you can access that paper online. It's open access, and you can find it through our website as well. Okay, so looking at the results for the modelling. So you can imagine that we parameterize our model for the two different pathways, and then we're able to make projections through until 2030 or through until 2050. And essentially, the model projects the amount of progress that we make towards different SDG targets, as well as towards each of the 17 goals. And indeed, we can look at overall progress towards all 17 goals together. So when we look at the projections at the goal level, so this chart shows the amount of progress made by each of the two pathways towards each of the 17 goals. So for each of the goals there, we can see two bars. So the one on the left is the lightly shaded one, is the projection for the business as usual pathway. The one on the right, the darkly shaded one, is the projection for transforming Australia. And what we find when we look at those results for each of the 17 goals, that our Transform Australia pathway actually outperforms business as usual on almost all of the goals, on 16 of the 17 goals, but has particularly large gains in areas like poverty, in food and nutrition, in clean energy, in sustainable cities, in inequality, and in environmental goals like climate change, biodiversity, sustainable consumption and production, etc. And when we add all of those additional results up and look at the total progress that each pathway makes towards all 17 goals, we can see that our Transform Australia pathway achieves around 90% progress towards all of the targets by 2050. And this is, coming close to achieving the SDGs, whereas our business as usual pathway actually sort of peaks and stagnates and then declines over time, reaching about 55% progress by 2050. So this is important because it shows that, with these additional policies, we can boost progress on the SDGs. This means really tangible gains in a range of areas, and I'll dig a bit more into some of the specifics, but, halving poverty, reducing income inequality by a third, significant improvements in environmental indicators. We don't go all the way to achieving all the SDGs, perhaps because, there are still some trade-offs embedded in the SDGs. But, we can make significant improvements, which shows that, these targets may look really ambitious, but, there are ways that we can actually make practical advancements towards them. Now, one of the insights we can draw from the modelling is, if we look at the difference between those two pathways, we have 55% under business as usual, jumping up to 90% in our Transform Australia pathway. So what is it that makes that additional contribution to the SDGs? Which of the policies and transformations play a key role in that? And we can unpack this with our modelling. And what we see is that, each of those 6 transformations is really making an important and unique contribution to the SDGs by 2050. So the greatest outcome is actually when we implement all of these policies together, and that they are broadly complementary. But we also see that some of these transformations make a larger contribution towards additional SDGs achievement than others, particularly the wellbeing and resilience transformation, our environmental commons transformation, and energy decarbonisation. So this suggests areas perhaps where we can get more bang for our buck in terms of boosting progress on the SDGs by 2050. So we can also dig a bit more into each of these transformations. I won't go into all of them, I'll just cover a couple quickly, but when we look at wellbeing and resilience transformation, the policies that we include in that include additional investment in climate change adaptation and resilience, in health and education outcomes. And we also assume a more rapid transition to net zero, which reduces climate change impacts. And that really results in some tangible benefits, which include minimising the impacts of disasters on wellbeing, on infrastructure, on productivity and biodiversity, as well as boosting life expectancy and education outcomes. And they also have, important effects on productivity in Australia. So they boost productivity over the long term. So in these charts, we can see the projections to 2050 for the 2 pathways. Firstly, at the top there for persons affected by disasters. And we can see that the green Transform Australia pathway has a lower rate of people affected by disasters. And again, down the bottom, looking at life expectancy, we see that boost in life expectancy from our Transform Australia pathway. Looking at our second transformation on sustainable and just economy. So this really had 2 components to it, our just economy policies and our sustainable economy policies. Looking at the just economy policies, these include things like increasing social protection for the most disadvantaged Australians, as well as tax reforms that are really targeted towards high profits, high consumption levels and high income. And again, we see some really tangible benefits for Australia from these policies. We can actually halve poverty rate in Australia over the long term, and also reduce inequality by a third. So the charts on the right for poverty rate at the top and Gini coefficient, which is a measure of income inequality. And we see there that the Transform Australia pathway outperforming on both of those. Looking at the sustainable economy component of the transformation, so this includes policies such as an investment in green industry and manufacturing, as well as ambitious targets around resource efficiency and circular economy. And again, we see some really tangible benefits for Australia in terms of reducing material consumption by a third and boosting manufacturing output. So the charts on the right show manufacturing production as a share of GDP really being turned around thanks to these investments in green industry and manufacturing, and per capita material consumption also declining over time more rapidly than our business as usual. And look, this isn't really an SDGs indicator, but it's one that we're often asked about, which is the projection for GDP for Australia. And we see that over the long term, the projection is higher for Transform Australia than business as usual. And this is largely due to the additional productivity improvements in Transform Australia, as well as the productivity drag from climate change impacts. So we assume higher climate change impacts under business as usual due to a slower transition to net zero. So there's some other interesting insights we can draw from the modelling, including looking at policy interactions. So we can imagine that this energy decarbonisation scenario is really targeting things like renewable energy share and climate change emissions as sort of direct impacts for policies, but it also has a range of flow-on effects for other SDGs and what we could call co-benefits for other SDGs. And we can unpack these with a chart like this, where we really see each of these bars represents the amount of progress made on each of the 17 SDGs. So each bar represents one SDG, and the length of the bar represents the amount of progress made towards that SDG by 2050. So looking at SDG 1, which is on poverty, we can see that the grey segment of the bar is the amount of progress we make under business as usual. The coloured segments of the bar then show the additional contribution made by each of those 6 transformations. So the colours correspond to the transformations. So for example, if we look at wellbeing and resilience in light blue, we see that that actually has a really considerable impact on SDG 1, on poverty, with significant gains. And we also see big gains on SDG 11 on sustainable cities, on SDG 13 on climate change adaptation, but also these co-benefits are across a range of other goals. Whereas if we look at the green colour there, the environmental regeneration, we see that the most significant gains there are on SDG 14 and 15, which are our biodiversity goals. We can also extract these results for a particular transformation if we want to take a closer look at them and really understand these co-benefits a bit more. So this is the additional benefits that energy decarbonisation has for all of the SDGs. And we see here that these direct impacts on SDG 7, clean energy, SDG 13, climate change. So big gains in those areas, but also co-benefits across a range of other areas, including sustainable industry. So it really enables progress on sustainable industry, it boosts economic indicators, sustainable cities, even things like poverty and inequality. And we can sort of unpack the reasons for this in the modelling as well. But it really just helps to paint this broader picture of the implications of different policies and different transformations for Australia, that there are these co-benefits associated with these transformations that we should be aware of and try to harness and optimise. Another way of looking at these interactions is by what we call positive spillovers. So this is how one transformation enables another transformation. For example, how does energy decarbonisation help to also transform our economy? And we do that with a chart like this. So this essentially quantifies these positive spillover effects. So the width of these flows represents the amount of beneficial effects or beneficial spillovers, or the magnitude of beneficial spillovers from one transformation on the left through to another transformation on the right. So on the left, we have the providers of spillovers, and the right, the beneficiaries of these spillovers. And what we glean from this is that our energy decarbonisation transformation in yellow there actually has the largest amount of positive spillovers. So it's really helping to enable transformations, and we look at across to the right, particularly a sustainable and just economy, sustainable cities, regenerating the environment. Similarly, when we look at wellbeing and resilience in light blue there, it has large beneficial spillovers for the economy, food systems, cities, etc. So what this says is that these types of transformations, because they help to unlock opportunities in other areas, they could be prioritised for early investment and early intervention. Looking at the other side, we also see that there are real beneficiaries of these positive spillovers, including the sustainable and just economy and regenerating the environmental commons. And this suggests that we won't really be able to transform our economy unless we undertake some of these other transformations first. And energy decarbonisation is really central to that. On the environmental commons, again, we see that we won't really be able to regenerate the environmental commons without these other transformations also taking place. In particular, the dark blue food systems transformation there is particularly important for regenerating the environmental commons. So that's the end of the slides on our modelling results. And I'd just like to return to some of these key messages. John mentioned these before, but just to sum up, I guess, when we look at our assessment results, we're really seeing mixed progress for Australia. Australia is really performing well in some areas, but there are concerning areas where we're going backwards. And I think this is, areas where we should really focus our efforts to help improve performance and turn those negative trends around. The modelling results show that it is actually possible to turn these trends around, that we can really boost performance on the SDGs in really tangible areas. Through more ambitious action. And, this can be structured around these 6 transformations or six domains that have the greatest potential to accelerate performance on the SDGs. But in order to do that, we really need to shift to a more integrated and long-term approach to decision-making. And our progress report this time really tries to give some tools to help operationalise this type of thinking. Including, the use of regular, transparent, balanced assessments of progress that cover, these economic, social, environmental domains. Adopting 2030 targets and even longer term targets through to 2050, and evaluating progress based on long-term trends, not just the short-term trends. And also the use of tools like scenario modelling of policies, investments that, we can do that ex ante, we can simulate their effects to look at, both the scale of investment that might be needed, as well as, which policies can deliver the greatest gains for different targets, which ones deliver the greatest co-benefits, and where there might be trade-offs as well. And I'd just like to finish by saying that, our Transform Australia pathway is quite government focused. We look at a range of different policy levers, and government indeed does have a key role to play, particularly, around tax reforms, social policy, public services, etc. But the policies are also designed to incentivise private investment. So a range of the policy measures are really more about driving investment in key areas that can boost progress on the SDGs, as well as around behaviour change for Australia. So it's not just all about government. It's also crucial for all actors to play a role in trying to shift us towards this pathway for a more sustainable future. Thank you.
Hey, we'd now like to open up for questions, and I'm going to kick one off to John, so I'll just get you to unmute, John. And do you have any recommendations as to how we take this forward?
Thanks, Nicola. Well, the first thing to do is to have these type of assessments of progress as part of policy making. And we'd like to see the Australian government and state governments do a similar process of assessing across the whole of the economy and society and the environment, and regularly reporting on that to Parliament. So that's the first thing. The second would be to adopt targets, or to at least to set benchmarks for the various goals that we've had. And I know governments are normally very cautious about that, but so long as these are realistic and consistent with the sort of targets that our comparable peer countries are setting, then it is reasonable for government to do that. And the third would be to utilise the type of modelling that Cameron has done, not to determine the policy necessarily, but at least to be used as a policy tool in developing policies. So we can see that by using these different policy levers, the impact we can have. One of the biggest problems that we have is that we set policies to achieve one aim, and we don't take account of the spillover effects on other aims or goals. And this type of modelling is very helpful because it does identify those spillover impacts.
And I think related, John, to your answer there, we've got a question from Kate, who's wondering how we encourage that local patient capital investment to achieve the SDGs. Do the target setting and long-term views help with that?
It does. And if you look at superannuation funds, for example, they do care about the long-term sustainability of society because that's where their members live. And a successful, prosperous, socially fair and environmentally sustainable society is more likely to be good for their members' well-being, but importantly for their investments. You see around countries that haven't a safe or equitable environment, that also has a negative impact on investments. So engaging with investors and engaging with pension funds, with superannuation is important. And interestingly, the superannuation industry did support our first 2018 Transforming Australia report because they saw this as important for their members.
Great, thank you. A couple of questions for you, Cameron. Is there anything in the results that sort of surprised you or really jumped out at you?
Well, thanks, Mick. Yeah, I mean, there's just so much information that we've gained from this assessment, and I encourage you to take a look through our website. I've only really touched on some of the key findings. But I think, firstly, if we look at the assessment results, we did a comparison of what's really changed since 2020 when we did our last assessment, and we sort of classified these as rapid gains and rapid losses. So I think some of those have been surprising. That last assessment, the energy transition and greenhouse gas emissions were not doing great, and that has actually turned around in recent years. I think also the indicators on gender equality have been improving. And I think this is interesting because it shows areas where government policy have really made a difference. In terms of the rapid losses, one of the concerning ones was really around this socioeconomic parity in education outcomes. I think that's surprising how quickly that has declined. And it'd be interesting to look at the reasons for that in Australia. It seems to be a trend that's happening in other OECD countries as well. And it's particularly important because it can entrench long-term disadvantage. So education is really fundamental to opportunities in life and to subsequent income and standard of living that you'll have. So I think that trend is really worrying and something that would be would be worth taking a closer look at. In terms of the modelling, I think something surprising was that how complementary a lot of these policies are. That when we implement them together, they each have a unique contribution to the SDGs. I didn't really touch on trade-offs today. We do see some trade-offs in there as well, but we see a lot more co-benefits than trade-offs, which was something that's surprising. Though we can't really, even with this ambitious set of policies, we don't ever really reach 100% achievement of the SDGs, which is interesting. So there must be, some trade-offs embedded in the results that we're, yet to really unpack and take a closer look at.
Great, thank you. There's a question about climate action not being green, but I think that's because you say it hasn't improved as quickly as we would have liked to meet target. There's also a couple of questions in here around material consumption and can economic growth continue to grow with declining consumption and material consumption?
Well, yes, based on our results, we can see that when we look at our projections, incomes do continue to grow over time and material consumption comes down. Though, I mean, the more quickly the economy grows, the harder it is to reduce to have that overall reduction in materials. So, there is a relationship there between, economic growth and material consumption. But the results show that we can actually, decouple these things and reduce material consumption in Australia. albeit not fast enough really to reach our targets. So this, if we wanted to reach our, ambitious material consumption targets in Australia, that would have, stronger implications for, economic growth and incomes. If we put really ambitious material efficiency targets, for example.
And another question on the modelling, Cameron, apart from reduced climate-related productivity effects, what else is driving the productivity improvements in your model?
Well, a range of things. It's obviously a really complex model that includes a range of different drivers and feedbacks. So productivity in the model in different sectors includes drivers like education and health outcomes, infrastructure, governance, etc. So these provide feedbacks to productivity. Now, when we include policies that boost education, that boost health, that reduce poverty rates, these all have beneficial effects on productivity over the long term. Because if you reduce poverty, you actually increase incomes for low-income households. That that income is a key driver for health and education outcomes, which then feed back to productivity over the long term. So it's not necessarily any one thing. It's a range of different drivers that influence productivity and provide that boost over time.
Great, thank you. John, I'm going to throw this one to you. There's been a few comments in the chat, one about are the SDGs still a valid framework? And two, where are they heading next? But I think that linking into this third one, what's the public appetite to support the SDGs and transformation, and how do we advance this, taking into account public thinking in Australia?
I think if you ask most of the public about the SDGs, they won't know what they are. I mean, that's the reality. On the other hand, if you ask, do you want your children to have a decent education, tertiary education? Do you think it's appropriate that 14-year-old kids from the lower socioeconomic area have a 58% worse outcome in maths than kids in the top quintile? People say, no, that's unfair and we want to change that. So I don't think we should get too hung up on the SDGs per se. What we should be really focusing on are the particular goals and targets, and do people care about them? And overwhelmingly, if you look at polling, people do. They want a prosperous economy, they want a fair society, and they want a clean environment. So these goals really are simply a summary of the sort of things that people want. I do think there is an issue now with people very focused, understandably, on cost of living, where some of these longer term issues like climate change, like inequality, are becoming second order issues in the public debate, but they're going to come back. And the example of this that I would use is housing, where 15 years ago we weren't talking about housing, but we allowed a whole lot of policies to be put in place that have led to massive housing problems and lack of accessibility to affordable housing. And this sort of process can help identify those longer term issues that may not be top of mind today, but they're going to bite us in the future if we don't take action. So short answer, it wasn't a short answer, it's probably too long an answer, but they are important, the goals, not because of what they're called, but because they do address the issues that families and people around the country care about.
Great, thank you. There's a couple of questions here, and I'll go to both of you to see what you think here. But how do we encourage more individual and business uptake of the SDGs? I'm condensing a few questions in together, and stop them being the next kind of thing that's greenwashed. Can the model even help private enterprises, Cameron, for example, look at what their contribution can make? But yeah, how do we get them involved? I'll throw to you first, Cameron, individuals and businesses.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as John mentioned, awareness of the SDGs is really it's not widespread in Australia. But Australia does have other initiatives which are very aligned with the SDGs. So I think, as John mentioned, we don't necessarily need to promote, the SDGs in themselves, but the outcomes that are embedded in the SDGs. And I think things like the wellbeing framework, the net zero transition, the circular economy work that's underway, all of these things contribute to the SDGs. So I think we can look at, what types of shifts are needed to achieve those, because they're likely to be things that will support the SDGs. And we see that in the modelling as well. And, in terms of an investment perspective, looking at things like, energy decarbonisation is a key area which requires a considerable amount of investment, and our modelling shows has really broad co-benefits for Australia, which can unlock opportunities in a range of different economic sectors as well, in green industry, manufacturing, etc. So this highlights, areas where business can certainly target investment to have, to stimulate these broader gains on the SDGs. And the modelling helps to show, the co-benefits associated with that, the amount of investment that would be needed, and how that drives, beneficial outcomes for a range of different goals.
Thank you. And we're almost at time. So John, I'll throw to you for some closing remarks. We haven't gotten through all the Q&A, which have been great, but we can certainly get in touch and encourage you to get in touch with us to answer more detailed questions, specifically around the indexation and the modelling and some really detailed technical stuff like that. But John, I'll throw to you now for some remarks before we close.
Well, thanks, Nicola. It's a pity we haven't been able to address all of those questions because they raise really important issues, but we will look at them and consider them. But what flows through a lot of them is politics. A lot of the questions are about how do we actually deliver on this, whether it's in households, individuals, businesses, or more broadly across society. And what the first thing you're going to need to do to achieve that is to have more of a conversation about these issues. And that's what we hope to have achieved today, to stimulate that conversation with good evidence and data to back it up. We don't have all the answers, but we at least have some interesting evidence to inform that conversation. And we want to go forward with you, the people on the call, to continue that conversation. And we look forward to any input you've got to send to us, and we hope that that can be incorporated in future work that we do on transforming Australia. So thank you very much for attending today, and we look forward to keeping the conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you.